Are you enjoying this podcast? Well, you have KUOW members to thank for that. KUOW members make the trusted local journalism and storytelling you hear on this show possible. Become a member today and help support the production of this podcast. It only takes a minute. Make a donation at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thanks.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Diana Opong. Chances are high that you've never been to McNeil Island before. If you have, the island, located in the Puget Sound, southwest of Tacoma, isn't accessible to the general public. The only people that are allowed are staff and pre-screened visitors at the Washington State Special Commitment Center, the first post-prison institution for people designated as sexually violent predators. Around 515 people have been detained in the Special Commitment Center program since 1990. But now a new report from the Seattle Times shows that for the first time in its history, the center is releasing more patients than it's taking in. What that means for these patients and the general public depends on who you ask. Here to shed some light and help make sense of things is Seattle Times investigative reporter Rebecca Moss. Rebecca, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
McNeil Island has an infamous history. It's been called the Alcatraz of the Puget Sound and was previously a federal and then a state prison. I just gave a brief description of what the center is like, but let's dive deeper. What exactly is a special commitment center?
So the Special Commitment Center in Washington is a place where the state detains people under 24/7 surveillance in a secure facility. In this version in Washington, that is on an island setting within layers of barbed wire and locked doors and many security staff. People are not free to come and go as they please. They have various areas that are out of bounds, even to the residents themselves, and things are regimented like any other institution.
So similar to potentially a conventional prison, would you say it's closer, it sounds like based on your description, that's closer sort of like to a maximum security location?
Well, for the center to legally and constitutionally operate, it is very important that it does not replicate prison, because doing so would potentially become a double jeopardy situation. And this has been extensively litigated in Washington up to the U.S. Supreme Court level. So there are elements that are institutionalized, and it is an institution, but it is required to be a treatment facility as well. And that therapeutic element is, and the ability for the residents who are placed there to receive mental health care is part of what allows it to legally operate.
How does someone end up at the Special Commitment Center?
There's a few ways. The most common way is that somebody has committed serial sexual violence that has resulted in a prison sentence. And near the end of that prison sentence, they can be reviewed for whether or not they are sort of a candidate. And there's a sort of extensive process for this. And then the state or the attorney general can petition to have them committed to the Special Commitment Center. And that process involves pretty extensive psychological evaluation to see if they meet a criteria established by Washington State, which says that a person has an underlying mental abnormality, also a Washington State term, or a personality disorder. And that, combined with their criminal history, makes them more likely than not to potentially reoffend in the future.
In your reporting, you note that in recent years, the center has been releasing more people than usual. How many people are typically held at the center, and how many are currently being released?
Sure. So for the first essentially 20 years that the Special Commitment Center was in operation, there were an increasing number of people being committed each year, upwards of 25 to 35 in the mid-2000s. The population in the total confinement center on McNeil Island in that secure setting peaked at about 285 in 2011. And again, a lot of statistics and numbers here, but that date is important because in 2012, that was the first time that the trends switched. And while very few people had been released up until that point, that year, more people began being released each year, either unconditionally free from the entire commitment process or into less restrictive alternative housing in which they were still supervised by the court, but not under the level of security on the island that people in total confinement are. And that trend has continued so that now dozens of people are being released each year, both with and without condition, and just a handful of people are being committed or detained there.
Got it. And I want to make sure I understand something, Rebecca. The program, the Special Commitment Center program, has been around since at least 1990, but it hasn't always been on McNeil Island. Where was it before? And then when did they move to McNeil Island?
It started at the Monroe Correctional Complex, and in 1998, the program moved to McNeil Island, which at that time was still a state prison. Its primary use at that time had been this longstanding prison. And in 2003, it moved to its current home, which is sort of in the center of the island, which is now what is known as the Special Commitment Center.
Why is the state releasing more people from the Special Commitment Center?
There are a number of reasons. In interviews, we've got many different answers from different people. There are a couple clear things, though, that we can point to. One is the lifting of the Touré injunction in 2007. This was a very big case that was filed soon after the Commitment Center began operating and challenging whether or not it was essentially legal for people to be detained following their prison sentence on the island by states. And the state was placed under an injunction for over a decade under the condition that it ensure that people were being provided adequate mental health care, but also that they had a pathway to one-day leave. And that really wasn't something that had been clearly outlined or available to people when the law was first enacted and put into place. So as that injunction lifts, the data shows us that more and more people were releasing following that date. And the state was very aware at that time as well that that release was important for it to stay constitutional and to avoid future legal action. The other thing that happened at that time is that new research was being published that looked at the recidivism rates of people who had committed sex crimes. What was found, the larger studies in 2012, is that the earlier risk assessments that had been conducted by Washington and other states who implemented these programs had inflated the risk of dangerousness and likelihood for someone to reoffend. And in fact, as these tools, various risk assessment tools that are used to determine future dangerousness, were recalibrated, more people were eligible for release when that information was presented in court. Another piece of that finding that was really crucial is that it found that people over the age of 60 were less likely to reoffend. And because many people had been held at the Special Commitment Center or in prison and then the Special Commitment Center, there was and there is an aging population on McNeil Island.
So I want to clarify something, Rebecca. So as you mentioned, these are people who have served a sentence for sexual violence. They've technically done their time, and due to either a recommendation by the attorney generals or some other institution, it sounds like government agency, they are then potentially assigned to McNeil Island or another program, depending on their criminal history. Is that correct?
Sort of. It's not McNeil Island. It's not the Special Commitment Center or another program. It's more that either basically the attorney general's office or King County, which handles King County, the attorney general handles all the other counties, can basically, somebody goes up for review and can then, that person then goes through a trial or goes before a court to determine whether or not they meet the criteria to be committed. If they don't meet that criteria, they can be released. And so when someone goes through the commitment process, they are sent to the island as a detainee. And if the court or jury then finds that they don't meet this criteria and are not more likely than not to reoffend under these various mechanisms and through expert evaluation of the person, then they can be released. And some people have already been released, but there's a caveat of the law called a recent overt act. And that's another way in which people can also end up going through the commitment process.
Okay. But in general, and I really appreciate that clarification, these are folks who have served jail time. They have completed their jail time for whatever amount of time has been allowed. Either they've been given probation or parole, or their sentence has been, reduced. And it's after that that King County or the Attorney General's office can petition to say, we don't think they should be free to go to the general public. We think they need additional services and need to go to the Special Commitment Center.
Yes, essentially, that is the most likely scenario. There are other situations where people have not been in prison, but yes, by and large, that is what happens.
So, Rebecca, these people who have served a sentence for sexual violence have technically done their time. So how can the state legally continue to hold them?
So this is what the law established. The 1990 Community Protection Act was looking at what the state could do if after somebody had already been released from prison, but had, in the cases that sort of inspired this law, was demonstrating indications that they might harm people again. Essentially, because the two crimes that inspired this was a man on work release who murdered a woman and a man with serious mental illness who had been very explicit, despite being released from prison, that he intended to harm children again and went on to do so. And so lawmakers were trying to bridge a gap of how could they use what is a long-standing civil commitment process that's often days, weeks, months, usually in mental health circumstances, to detain people. But in this case, they use the law to hold people indefinitely based on their risk of repeat predatory sexual violence. And that is a carve out that is new, or was new to Washington at the time and really to the nation.
Can you paint a picture of what it's like living on McNeil Island? What is the facility like for the Special Commitment Center?
Sure. It's an interesting, I can explain what it's like to go there because it's a very beautiful island. But today, most of the existing buildings are boarded up, homes that used to be there from the old prison. And at the island center is the Special Commitment Center. So the people who are committed there are sort of escorted in, but once they're inside, they, are not bound in any way. They can wear normal clothing. They have their own rooms. They have their own possessions, but those have to be pre-approved by the state. And depending on where they are in their treatment process or in their behavioral health, they have different types of residential units. But in general, they're quite spare rooms and sort of communal spaces. And you go through many layers of security to go from residential unit to a dining unit to other facilities, vocational studies.
What kind of treatment or support do people receive at the center?
This has been an ongoing question, I think, for a lot of people, and one that has spurred a lot of lawsuits, and both from the Turi case that we discussed earlier and Disability Rights Washington, which was very concerned about the lack of treatment for people with cognitive disabilities on the island. According to a report that we reviewed, the average amount of treatment is about 5 hours a week. And that's like largely group treatment that people are participating in. People with cognitive disabilities receive less treatment, usually between 1 and 3 hours. And then there's usually about an hour of therapeutic individual therapy monthly.
Okay. And my apologies. Maybe I missed what you said. There's there's a different amount of services and the total number of therapy depending on their qualifications. But is the therapy only one kind of therapy? Like you said, there's community therapy, but is there individual art therapy? I guess I'm kind of curious, what kind of actual support do they receive? Is it medication, that type of thing?
Yes, that's a good question. So they have 5 hours of sex offender therapy treatment weekly, and that is the predominant form of therapy they have. There are other sort of activities. There's some vocational training and things that are optional like that they can take, but the therapy that is offered there is centered around what is called sex offender treatment.
What does it take to prepare a so-called sexually violent predator to leave the center?
Most likely, the way that that would be answered is that it's a case-by-case basis. People can go through therapy over years and engage in the sex offender treatment on the island. And that is what I meant by therapy there. And other people choose not to, and both have been released. So the release process is really the result of an assessment. And if somebody is found to no longer meet the criteria that committed them to the island, that is how they can be released. And the ways in which that under law is established is either through change in treatment or a physiological change, such as dementia or stroke. But essentially, every year a person undergoes an annual exam, an annual review, and it's a very lengthy document, and that is used to determine whether or not somebody still meets the criteria for being 50% or not more likely to reoffend if not detained in a secure facility.
This center also comes with a big budget. How much does it cost the state to keep the facility running?
Yeah, so we looked at how much the state has spent, in particular over the last year, and between 2014 and the present, the budget has increased by 115%. Currently, the average cost per person of people who are under DSHS supervision in this program is over $440,000 per year per person.
Wow, that is a big budget for sure. What happens when someone is released from the island? Where do they go? So they've passed their review and it's been decided, okay, you are not as likely to reoffend. What then?
So if somebody is unconditionally released, they are allowed to return to society. They are no longer, their therapy, their sex offender treatment, their housing, none of that is paid for by the state anymore. And the only requirement is that they register as a sex offender in the county in which they live, either in Washington or if they move out of state.
And so there's conditional release and unconditional release. Is that accurate?
Yes. So if somebody is conditionally released, their treatment is still paid for by the state, their housing usually, and they are under court-ordered conditions. And this is really the focus of our next story in the series, but they are basically in strict supervision from the court. They have to have a GPS monitor. They have requirements about where they can and cannot go, staff that do regular check-ins on their location. So a lot of monitoring and conditions like no drinking and things like that can be part of it.
You've done some very thorough research into what happens after people leave the Special Commitment Center. How often do people reoffend after they leave?
So we looked at types of reoffense, and overall, we found that 1 in 4 people had reoffended in some manner. And then we broke that down into serious and less severe offenses. And of the more serious, we found 1 in 7 had reoffended in a more serious or violent way. And half of those people had reoffended in a sexually violent manner that may have been indicative of the thing that they did that led to their commitment.
You spend a lot of time tracking people down who were formerly held at the Special Commitment Center. Does the state keep track of people after they leave McNeil Island?
No, it does not.
Why don't they keep track of people after they leave the island?
Well, according to the state, that's just not what's built into their mandate. So when someone's uncommitted, they are no longer, sort of under the purview of DSHS. But I think that's part of what we wanted to look at as well. What does it mean to spend a lot of time and money rehabilitating people and not know what happens afterwards?
Something that struck me about your reporting was the lack of monitoring throughout the commitment process. So, for example, there aren't independent inspections of the treatment program on McNeil Island, and people aren't tracked when they leave. Why is that the case?
I think the why is somewhat unknown, but the result is that we don't have a good sense of if the basic promise that Washington made in creating this law is actually playing out as intended. The state said that civilly committing people and sort of suspending their freedoms for a period of time for treatment would make society safer. But if we don't know what's happening when they're on the island or what happens when they leave, then we don't have a good sense of if Washington's time and money is being used as intended to help the people on the island and help the public live in a safer society.
And is that in part because this is the first special commitment type program in the nation? And so there's really no bar that's already been set or a reference point that, has already existed?
I'm sure that could be a contributing factor. I think, but it's now been in operation for 34 years. There's 19 other states and the District of Columbia and the federal government that have programs like this. There's, national conventions. So there's been a lot of research and a lot of study, but that hasn't been standardized in a way or formalized in the way that we have seen in other types of behavioral health settings or institutional settings.
What does the public want to see done about the center and the people who live there? Do they want them to remain on the island or be moved elsewhere?
There's certainly been the last couple legislative sessions have had some proposals that didn't go very far, and I think there are certainly people who want the people on the island to stay on the island forever, and that's certainly not constitutional. And I think is only looking at a piece of it and maybe a little bit of the fear around the terms that the state created to define this population. I think it will be interesting to see how lawmakers consider this moving forward, because it has been something that's been in the political sphere and legislative conversation for the last few years. But certainly there are neighborhoods in Washington who have been protesting the less restrictive alternative housing and wanted to ensure that those homes didn't end up in their communities. That, again, the Attorney General has been very clear that is not legal. So I'm not sure that there's a solution that we've seen. I think there's been a lot of conversation. And I think from the people on the island themselves, I think in the interviews that I've had, I think people want to have effective treatment, and they want to have basic civil liberties, and they want to have the opportunity to succeed after they're released.
What does this lack of oversight tell you as a reporter?
I think it raises a lot of questions about what we can and can't say. And I think, one thing we like to do as reporters is to look at data, look at the evidence. How do you back up a statement? That's what we like to do in our own work. And I think it's very difficult to know whether what is happening at the facility is helping the people there or the public without that kind of meaningful oversight. So I think it raises a lot of questions about what this program's function is.
So this is part of an ongoing series for the Seattle Times called Uncommitted. What's next for this series?
So we'll be looking at the less restrictive alternative housing and a lot of the nuance and complexity around that program as well, which is sort of the other side of the unconditional release right now. It's a transition into the community, and there's been laws that have changed that process in the last few years. And so we'll be looking at that more closely in our next story.
Rebecca Moss is an investigative reporter for the Seattle Times. Go check out her full report at seattletimes.com. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.
Hi there, I'm Monica Guzman, host of A Braver Way podcast and your guide across the political divide. Are you done with the divisiveness in our politics and ready to do something about it? This season, we've partnered with KUOW to reach more listeners like you. Join me as I sit down with guests from across the political spectrum. Together, we'll share tools, insights, and messy, real-life stories to help you face this election year without losing heart. Listen to A Braver Way now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.